Hi, guys, and today we're going to be reading Chapter 6. Now, in Chapter 6, Gatsby gets more attention than what he wants. And here we go. About the Times, an ambitious young reporter in New York arrived one morning at Gatsby's door and asked him if they had anything to say. Anything to say about what? Inquired Gatsby politely. Why, any statement to give out. It transpired, after a confused 5 minutes, that the man had heard Gatsby's name around the office in connection which he either couldn't reveal or didn't fully understand. This was his day off, and he, with laudable initiative, he had hurried out to see. It was a random shot, yet the reporter's instinct was right. Gatsby's notoriety spread around by hundreds who had accepted his hospitality, and so had become authorities on his past, and increased all summer until he fell short of being news. Contemporary legends, such as an underground pipeline to Canada, that says that he's a bootlegger and is bringing in illegal booze from to the U.S. Oh, sorry. Attached themselves to him. And there was one persistent story that he didn't live in a house at all, but in a boat that looked like a house and was moved secretly up and down the Long Island shore. Just why these inventions were a source of satisfaction to James Gatz of North Dakota isn't easy to say. James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name. He had changed it in the age of 17, and at that specific moment, that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Don Cody's yacht dropped anchor off the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz, who had been loafing around the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants, but it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out to the Tolkomi, and and informed Cody that a wind caught might catch him and break him up in half an hour. I suppose he had a name ready for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. He was the son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. He must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, meretricious beauty. So he invented just that sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. Okay, so let's go over a couple of things, because that was a lot of vocabulary, which could be a little confusing. But let's go take a look at our questions. Why did the reporter appear at Gatsby's door? Strangely enough, he showed up at his door just because I hear your name a lot around, like, the office, and there must be something that's a story about you. So I just came to ask. Yet, a story? What is Gatsby's legal name? We know that it is James Gatz. So he's kind of close, but not cigar. When did Gatsby change his name? Well, we know that he changed his name when he was 17 years old. He had made up this fictitious character about what a rich, sophisticated man should do and look like. And he kind of stuck with that. But think about what you thought rich and sophisticated people were like when you were 10 versus what you think rich and sophisticated people are now. And in 10 years, it'll change again. But the fact that he made this up at 17 and stuck to it is kind of odd. We'll get back to that later. We don't have the answer for 4, so let's go back to the text. Oh, when it talks about this, the Son of God, what he's saying is that he was not conceived as a child and brought up as a child. There was no Jay Gatsby 10 years old. So what he did was he created this character himself, and in doing so, made himself literally his own man, which is strange because in the world of literature, and especially at this time, there's a very special term called a self-made man, which means a person that actually earned all of their own riches. In this case, it was he invented this character himself. Let us continue. For over a year, he had been beating his way along the south shore of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher, or in any other capacity that brought him food and a bed. His brown, hardening body lived naturally through the half fierce, half lazy work of the bracing days. He knew women early, and since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins because they were ignorant, and others because they were hysterical about things which were his overwhelming self absorption he took for granted. So we now know why he doesn't like women very much, because he saw them as either a way to get money for that day or as silly, ignorant children who didn't understand the world. But his heart was in his constant, turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. A universe of ineffable it means that you can't really explain it or understand it. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself in his brain, while the clock ticked in the washstand and the moon soaked with wet light he tangled his tangled clothes upon the floor. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies, until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an obvious embrace. For a while, these revelries provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on a fairy's wing. What he's saying there is that Gatsby spent all of his time dreaming up a life, but instead of actually making a life. So I'm going to be beautiful and smart, and I'm going to have all this money and all this power. But he had no way to do so, and he never worked at trying to better himself. He just imagined and imagined and imagined. Let us continue. An instinct towards the future glory had led him, some months before, to a small Lutheran college of St. Olaf in South Minnesota. He stayed there 2 weeks, dismayed at its furious indifference to the drums of his destiny, to destiny itself, and despising the janitor's work with which he was to pay his way through. Then he drifted back to the Lake Superior. So he did try to go to college, try to make something of himself, but they didn't understand how important he was. They didn't understand what he was going to be, and they didn't treat him with the due respect. So he left. Mm. And he was still searching for something to do on that day when Dan Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows along the shore. Cody was 50 years old then, a product of Nevada's silver fields, of the Yukon, of every rush of metal since '75. The transactions in Montana copper that had made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust, but on the verge of soft-mindedness, and suspecting this infinite number of women tried to separate him from his money. The none too savory ramifications by which Ella Key, a newspaper woman, played Madame de Mention to his weakness, and sent him to sea in a yacht, were common knowledge in the turgid journalism of 1902. He had been coasting along all too hospitable shores for 5 years when he turned up as James Gats's destiny in a little girl bay. At the young To the young Gats, resting on his oars and looking up at the rail deck, the yacht represented all the beauty and glamour in the world. I suppose he smiled at Cody, and he had probably discovered that people liked him when he smiled. At any rate, Cody asked him a few questions. One of them elicited the brand new name, and found that he was quick and extravagantly ambitious. A few days later, he took him to Duluth and bought him a blue coat, 6 pairs of white duck trousers, and a yachting cap. And when the Ptolemy left for the West Indies and the Barbary Coast, Gatsby left too. He was employed as a vague personal capacity. While he remained with Cody, he was in turn steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailer. For Dan Cody sober knew what lavish doings Dan Cody drunk might soon be about, and he provided for such contingencies by reposing more and more trust in Gatsby. The arrangement lasted 5 years, during which the boat went 3 times around the continent. It may have lasted indefinitely, except for the fact that Ella Key came on board one night in Boston, and a week later Dan Cody inhospitably died. Ooh. Okay, so what is Gatsby employed as prior to meeting Dan Cody? He's a clam digger, which is basically literally you dig for clams. He also does just about any kind of odd job to get by. So he makes enough money to get a bed and food for the day, and then that's it. How did Dan Cody make his fortune? Super easy. He went to the Yukon Gold Rush. He dealt with silver fields. He made a ton of money in copper in Montana. He really did a lot of good investing in metals. Explain what relationship Gatsby had with Cody. What work did Gatsby do for him? Now, here's the deal. He was his best friend. He's basically what was called a paid companion at the time. You were paid to be friends with somebody who might not have might have a ton of money and not exactly trust people so much. So what ended up happening was Dan Cody, he met a lady. Of course, we know her name now is Ella Key, and he was getting a little too friendly with her, and she was trying to get married to him, and he was like, nah. So he jumped on a boat and stayed on it for 5 years to stay away from her. And so he paid Gatsby to, basically be his friend, help him out with a boat, um, just easy stuff. But he also puts in this really particular part where he was his jailer, because evidently Dan Cody was an alcoholic and was a less than trustworthy or less than um, happy drunk. And so Gatsby's job was to keep him from A, doing something stupid like getting married when he was drunk, and B, keep him from doing anything like getting in a fight that might end in him having to pay out a ton of money. So Gatsby was basically his best buddy slash first mate slash jailer when he was drunk in order to keep him um, out of trouble. But then we have this really weird part where Ella Key does find them. She gets on the boat in Boston, and the last and then one night in Boston, and a week later, Dan Cody's inhospitality died. So did he die? No, his inhospitality died, which means he decided he was going to marry her. And then now, what's Gatsby supposed to do? I remember a portrait of him in Gatsby's bedroom. That's really an odd place to put a picture of another guy. A gray floored man with a hard, empty face. The pioneer debauch who during one phase in American life brought back to the eastern seaboard a savage violence for the frontier brothel and saloon. It was indirectly due to Cody that Gatsby drank so little. Sometimes, in the course of a gay parties, women used to rub champagne into his hair. For himself, he formed the habit of letting liquor alone. So we know that Gatsby kind of understands that getting drunk and being a drunk leads to your end. So he doesn't do this. Pardon me. And it was from Cody that he inherited the money, a legacy of $25,000. He didn't get it. He never understood the legal device that was used against him. But what remained of the millions went intact to Ella Kay. He was left with his singularly appropriate education. The vague contour of J. Gatsby had filled out to substantiability of a man. So here's where we get it. Okay, so he didn't get all of Cody's riches. What ended up happening is Cody only got $25,000, and then Ella Kay, which we assume got married to him, got everything else. Now, we go over what could be the singularly appropriate education Gatsby received. Well, he learned how to be a millionaire. He learned how to act, and he learned how to behave, and he learned, what was the best caviar, and he learned how to deal with people. And in doing so, he learned all of this, but was only given $25,000. But now he believed himself to be Jay Gatsby. How can Jay Gatsby go back to being a regular man when he lives a millionaire's life and he goes around the continent 3 times? So it's rather interesting that Cody dies. He's now in a position where he can never be happy going back to regular life, but he doesn't have the money to sustain that type of lifestyle. He told me all this very much later, but I've put it down here with the idea of exploding those first wild rumors about his antecedents, which aren't even faintly true. Moreover, he told it to me at a time of confusion, when I had reached the point of believing everything and nothing about him. So I take advantage of this short halt while Gatsby, so to speak, caught his breath, to clear this set of misconceptions away. It was a halt, too, in my association with his affairs. For several weeks I didn't see him or hear his voice on the phone. Mostly I was in New York, trotting around with Jordan and trying to integrate myself into her senile aunt. And finally I went over to his house one Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been there 2 minutes when somebody brought Tom Buchanan in for a drink. I was startled, naturally, but this really surprising thing was that it hadn't happened before. They were a party of three on horseback, Tom and a man named Sloane, and a pretty woman with brown riding habit that had been there previously. "I'm delighted to see you," said Gatsby, standing on his porch. "I'm delighted that you dropped in." As though they cared. "Sit right down. Have a cigarette or a cigar." He walked around the room quickly, ringing bells. "I have something to drink for you in just a minute." He was profoundly affected by the fact that Tom was there, but he would be uneasy anyhow, until he was given them something, realizing in a vague way that this was all they came for. Mr. Sloane wanted nothing. A lemonade? No, thanks. A little champagne? Nothing at all, thanks. "I'm sorry. Did you have a nice ride?" "Very good roads round here." "I suppose the automobiles—" "Yeah." Moved by an irresistible impulse, Gatsby turned to Tom, who had accepted the introduction as a stranger. "I believe we've met somewhere before, Mr. Buchanan." "Oh, yes," said Tom, gruffly polite, but obviously not remembering. "So we did. I remember it very well." "About 2 weeks ago." "That's right. You were with Nick here. I know your wife," continued Gatsby, almost aggressively. "That's so." Tom turned to me. "You live here, Nick?" "Next door." "That's so." Mr. Sloane didn't enter onto the conversation, but lounged back haughtily in his chair. The woman said nothing either until, unexpectedly, after two highballs, she became cordial. Highballs are a type of cocktail. "Well, I'll come over for your next party, Mr. Gatsby," she suggested. "What do you say?" "Certainly, I'd be delighted to have you." "Very nice," said Mr. Sloane without gratitude. "Well, think I ought to be starting home." "Please don't hurry," Gatsby urged them. He had control of himself now, and as he wanted to see more of Tom. Why don't you stay for supper? I wouldn't be surprised if some other people dropped in from New York." "You come to supper with me," said the lady enthusiastically. "Both of you." This included me. Mr. Sloane got to his feet. "Come along," he said, but to her only. "I mean it," she insisted. "I'd love to have you lots of room." Gatsby looked at me questioningly. He wanted to go, and he didn't see that Mr. Sloane had determined he shouldn't. "I'm afraid I won't be able to," I said. "Well, you come," she urged, con- concentrating on Gatsby. Mr. Sloane murmured something close to her ear. "We won't be late if we start now," she insisted aloud. "I haven't got a horse," said Gatsby. "I used to ride in the army, but I've never bought a horse. I'll have to follow you in my car. Excuse me for just a minute." The rest of us walked onto the porch, where where Sloane and the lady began an impassioned conversation aside. "My God, I believe the man's coming," said Tom. "Doesn't he know she doesn't want him?" "She says she does want him." She's a she has a big dinner party, and he wouldn't know a soul there," he frowned. "I wonder where the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. They meet all kinds of crazy fish." Suddenly Mr. Sloane and the lady walked down the steps and mounted their horses. "Come on," said Mr. Sloane to Tom. "We're late. We've got to go." And then to me, "Tell him we couldn't wait. Will you?" Tom and I shook hands, and the rest of us exchanged a cool nod, and they trotted quickly down the drive, disappearing under the August foliage, just as Gatsby, with hat and light overcoat in hand, came out the front door. Tom was evidently perturbed by Daisy running around alone, for on this following Saturday night he came with her to Gatsby's party. So, that's rather interesting. So, describe the scene with the Sloanes and Tom appear at Gatsby's house. So, the entire thing is the Sloanes are trying to be passive aggressive. They don't want Gatsby because he's new money. He has money, but he doesn't have the breeding, nor does he have the manners that they're used to. And after a couple of drinks, Mrs. Sloane's like, hey, come on over to our house. We're having a dinner party. You can come with us. And Gatsby jumps at the chance because he's like, oh my God, that's great. This will be his chance to become part of the in crowd. But Mr. Sloane is very much against it, and they leave very quickly in order to avoid having to take them with him. So they snub him. It's very, very rude. And in this particular sense, it's extraordinarily mean. How does Daisy feel about Gatsby's party? Oh, sorry. How does Gatsby introduce Tom at the party? So now we have Tom, who's seen Gatsby, wants to know why he knows Daisy. So when Daisy comes to the party, he comes with her. Perhaps his presence gave the evening a particular quality of oppressiveness. It stands out in my memory from Gatsby's other parties that summer. There were same people, or at least the same sort of people, and the same profusion of champagne, and the same many-colored, many-keyed commotion. But I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps I had merely grown used to it, grown to accept West Egg as a world complete into itself, with its own standards and its own great figures, second to nothing, because it had no consciousness of being so. And now I was looking at it again through Daisy's eyes. It was invariably saddening to look through new eyes at things upon which you have extended your own powers of judgment. They arrived at twilight. As we strolled along the sparkling hundreds, Daisy's voice was playing murmurous tricks in her throat. These things excite me so, she whispered. If you want to kiss me any time during this evening, Nick, just let me know, and I'll be glad to arrange it for you. Just mention my name, or present a green card. I'm giving out green. Look around, suggested Gatsby. I'm looking around. I'm having a marvelous. You must see the faces of many people you've heard about. Tom's arrogant eyes roamed the crowd. We don't go around very much, he said. In fact, I was just thinking I don't know a soul here. Perhaps you know that lady. Gatsby indicated a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman who sat in state under a white palm tree. Tom and Daisy stared with the peculiarly unreal feeling that accompanies the recognition of a hereto ghostly celebrity of the movies. She's lovely, said Daisy. The man bending over her is her director. He took them ceremoniously from group to group. Mrs. Buchanan and Mr. Buchanan. After an instant's hesitation, he added, the polo player. Oh, no, objected Tom quickly. Not me. So how does Gatsby introduce Tom at the party? He introduces him as the polo player. He's trying to get on his good side, playing towards what he likes, but Tom doesn't like it so much. But evidently the sound of it pleased Gatsby, for Tom remained the polo player for the rest of the evening. I never met so many celebrities, Daisy exclaimed. I liked that man. What's his name? With the sort of blue nose? Gatsby identified him, adding that he was a small producer. Well, I liked him anyhow. I'd a little rather not be the polo player, said Tom pleasantly. I'd rather look at all of these famous people in oblivion. Daisy and Gatsby danced. I remember being surprised by his graceful, conservative foxtrot. I had never seen him in the dance before. When they sauntered over to my house and sat on the steps for half an hour while, at her request, I remained watchfully in the garden, in case there was a fire or a flood, she explained, or any act of God. So he's looking out for Tom. Tom appeared from his oblivion as we were sitting down to supper together. Do you mind if I eat with some people over there? He said. A fellow's getting off some funny stuff. Go ahead, answered Daisy gently. Sorry. And if you want to take down any addresses, here's my little gold pencil. She looked around after a moment and told me the girl was common but pretty, and I knew that except for the half an hour she had been alone with Gatsby, she wasn't having a good time. How does Daisy feel at Gatsby's party? She's very happy to be with Gatsby, and when she gets time alone with him, she enjoys it. But she has a problem with the fact that her husband is going around looking at other girls. And so much so that when he's like, "Oh, this, I'm gonna go eat over there with this guy. He's got, some, yeah." She's like, "Yeah, here's my pencil just in case you want to write down everybody's phone number." So she knows that he is a cad, and she's not enjoying herself so much when Tom's around. Let us continue. We were at a particularly tipsy table, and that was my fault. Gatsby had been called to the phone, and I had enjoyed these same people only 2 weeks before. What had amused me with them turned septic in the air now. How do you feel, Miss Bedecker? The girl addressed was trying unsuccessfully to slump against my shoulder. At this inquiry, she sat up and opened her eyes. What? A massive and lethargic woman who had been urging Daisy to play golf with her at the local club tomorrow spoke to Miss Bedecker defense. Oh, she's all right now. When she's had 5 or 6 cocktails, she always starts screaming like that. I tell her she ought to leave it alone. I do leave it alone, affirmed the accused hollowly. We heard you yelling, so I said to Dr. Crivet here, here's somebody that needs your help, Doc. She much obliged, I'm sure, but said another friend, without gratitude. But you got her dress all wet when you stuck her head in the pool. Anything I hate is to get my head stuck in a pool, mumbled Mrs. Bedecker. They almost drowned me once over in New Jersey. Then you ought to leave it alone, countered Dr. Cavett. Speak for yourself, cried Miss Bedecker violently. Your handshakes. I wouldn't let you operate on me. Hold for 1 second, please. So sorry, guys. Had to take a moment right there and get some thread. It came in the mail. Here we go. Then you ought to leave it alone, countered Dr. Cavett. Speak for yourself, cried Mrs. Bedecker violently. Your handshakes. I wouldn't let you operate on me. It was like that. Almost the last thing I remembered was standing with Daisy and watching the moving picture director and his star. They were still under the white plum tree, and their faces were touching except for the pale thin ray of moonlight between. It occurred to me that he had been very slowly bending toward her all evening to attain this proximity, and even while I watched I saw him stoop one ultimate degree and kiss her at the cheek. Now, it's really interesting because these people that he's sitting with and he's like dealing with, he's like realizing how like trashy they are. And we have Mrs. Bedecker who gets drunk, and then the doctor takes her head and puts it in the pool to sober her up. And then she's like, "Well, you shake," which is actually a it's she's accusing him of having the TDs, which is a type of intermittent tremor that you get when you're a serious alcoholic. And so he's like, they were fun last week and it was funny to watch them, but now this week or 2 weeks ago, it's just really annoying and kind of creepy. And so the mood of the evening is oppressive, as he says. He talks about how like things were funny and now they're just kind of sad. Who does Daisy admire at the party? I think we're going to go with the actress, but let's continue. I like her, said Daisy. I think she's lovely. But the rest offended her, and inarguably because it wasn't a gesture but an emotion. She was appalled by the West Egg, this unprecedented place, the Broadway, and the begotten upon Long Island fishing village, appalled by its raw vigor and the chafed under its old euphemisms, and by the too obtrusive fate that herded into inhabitants along a short cut from nothing to nothing. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. So Daisy really hates the party because these are not the type of people she normally hangs out with. Again, Gatsby's been throwing these parties to get her attention, and it's kind of uncomfortable because we realize he doesn't understand these are not her people. Just because they're rich does not mean that they are blue-blooded like she is. Now, if we take a look at who does Daisy admire at the party, she's admiring the movie star, which kind of shows us the change that is coming in American society, moving from the super rich as being celebrities to those on the silver screen being celebrities. Let us continue. I sat on the front steps with them while they waited for their car. It was dark there in the front, only a bright door sent 10 square feet of light volleying out into the soft black morning. Sometime a shadow moved against the dressing room blind above, gave way to another shadow, an indefinite procession of shadows, who rouged and powdered in an invisible glass. Who is this Gatsby anyhow? Demanded Tom suddenly. Some big bootlegger? Where did you hear that? I inquired. I didn't hear it, I imagined it. A lot of these newly rich people are just big bootleggers, you know. Not Gatsby, I said shortly. What does Tom guess Gatsby does for money? That he illegally imports alcohol into the US and sells it at a profit. That's what he thinks Gatsby does, and it's considered to be low since it is a criminal activity. The fact that he has money would mean nothing because he's a criminal and he's not blue-blooded. So Tom's trying to cast disparaging him. So, in all honesty, I think that is how he gets his money. But we'll have to take a look. But of course, Nick is a good friend. He pops up and he's like, "Don't say that." He was silent for a moment. The pebbles of the drive crunched under his feet. Well, he certainly must have strained himself to get this menagerie together. A breeze stirred, and the gray haze of Daisy's fur collar. At least they're more interesting than the people we know, she said with an effort. You don't look so interested. Well, I was. Tom laughed and turned to me. Did you notice Daisy's face when the girl asked her to put her under a cold shower? Daisy began to sing with the music in a husky, rhythmic whisper, bringing out the meaning of each word that in the melody rose. Her voice broke up sweetly, following it. That it had never had before and would never have again. When the melody rose, her voice broke up sweetly, following it, in a way contralto voices have, and each change tipped out a little of her warm, human magic upon the air. Lots of people come who haven't been invited, she said suddenly. The girl hadn't been invited. They simply forced their way in, and he's too polite to object. So Tom's trying to be like, hey, these people are trashy. And she's like, look, he's having a party. He's too polite to refuse anybody. These people weren't his friends. They're not invited. So she's trying to stake up for Gatsby too. I'd like to know who he is and what he does, insisted Tom, and I think I'll make a point of finding out. I can tell you right now, she answered. He owned some drugstores, a lot of drugstores. He built them up himself. The dilatory limousine came rolling up the drive. Good night, Nick, said Daisy. Her glance left me and sought the light up to the top of the steps that where 3 o'clock in the morning, a neat, sad little waltz of that year, was drifting out into the open door. After all, in the very casualness of Gatsby's party, there were romantic possibilities totally absent from her world. What was it up there in the song that seemed to be calling her back inside? What would happen now in the dim, uncalculable hours? Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rare, to be marveled at, some authentically radiant young girl, who, with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magic encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. I stayed late that night. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up, chilled and exalted from the black beach, until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. Then he came down the steps. At last, the tanned skin was drawn unusually tight on his face, and his eyes were bright and tired. She didn't like it, he said immediately. Of course she did. She didn't like it, he insisted. She didn't have a good time. He was silent, and I guessed that he had at his unutterable depression. I fell far away from her, he said. It's hard to make her understand. You mean about the dance? The dance? He dismissed all the dances he had given up with a snap of his fingers. Old sport, the dance is unimportant. He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she would go to Tom and say, I never loved you. After she had obliterated 3 years with that sentence, they could decide upon more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that, after she was free, they would go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. And she doesn't understand, he said. She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours. He broke off and began to walk up and down the desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. She can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking there in the shadows of his house, just out of his reach of his hand. I was going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see. Oh, man. So, yeah, we have Gatsby really wants Daisy, number 14. He wants Daisy to leave her marriage and tell her husband that the last 3 years was nothing to her, that she never wanted him, and that she only wanted to be with Jay. And so Gatsby is determined to go back 5 years ago and reset the clock and have them live out the fairy tale ending and dismiss the last 5 years as if it never happened. And when Nick tells him, look, you can't do that, that doesn't exist in real life, Gatsby's determination is, of course I can make that happen. What are you talking about? All I have to do is fix this. Let us continue. He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. One autumn night, 5 years ago, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there was no trees, and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. They stopped there and turned toward each other. Now it was cool night, with that mysterious excitement in it which comes at the 2 changes of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and a bustle among the stars. Out in the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalk really formed a ladder, and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb it, if he climbed alone, and once there he could suck on the pap of life, and gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and would forever wed, his unutterable visions of her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer at the turning fork, that he had been stuck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Though all he said, even though his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I'd heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment a phrase tried to take a shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was some struggling upon them to wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was incommunicable forever. So we're going to stop right there. So that ending of that chapter is kind of difficult because we're trying to take a look at, he's telling him about the past, and then Nick takes the past and he turns it into what is called an allegory, which is a huge metaphor that means a whole lot, and it takes in some instances it takes an entire book to figure out what it is. Now, what does Gatsby tell Nick about the past? How does he reflect on his character and add insight into his motivations? He tells Nick that he met her 5 years ago. He fell desperately in love with her, but he realized he was beneath her, and that the only way that he was ever going to make it was by himself, that he would go off by himself, climb the ladder of success, and that once he got to the top and he was rich and famous, he could go back and get her, but that he couldn't do it with her, and that he had to do this in order to keep her. So how does this reflect upon the character and add insight into his motivations? That's all up to you guys. It really could be, in all honesty, that Gatsby is a wonderful person, but that he really got it into his head because he's kind of immature that the only way that she would want him is if he was rich and famous. So he's going to be rich and famous, and he couldn't have her and do it at the same time. He needed to be by himself. And this shows us that yes, he really is kind of immature, especially at this point in time. And two, he really thinks that if he achieves the fantasy, if he is rich and powerful and famous, that he can have her, even if she's married. And that might tell you that he does have some moral lacking there because he's willing to have her separate herself from Tom, get a divorce, and marry him. He's very self centered and he's extraordinarily conceited because his thing is once I'm good enough, you'll want me and you'll leave everything for me. And that's asking a lot of a person, but he doesn't see it as that. So he's really immature. Let us go. Describe the images presented at the end of the chapter. What do they mean? Ladder. Of course, the ladder is ladder of success. It is the idea that you can move up social standing by what you do or what you say, but most of all, how much money you make. So he's sitting there saying, okay, I can do this. I can be what she wants me to be. I just have to get there first, and then I can have her. Flower, of course, is supposed to be a growing of her love for him. Now, some people think that this is actually an innuendo that they had sex. It could be. It's not exactly put there. That's the reason why symbolism is so wonderful, is you can take it any way you want. But the entire ideology, the flower is supposed to be this growing love. She kisses him. She is perfection. She is growing to love him in her affections. And now he sees that all he has to do is become perfect and she'll want him and he can have it all back and he can erase the fact that he was born a poor farmer's kid. So we'll see how it goes for him. I don't think it's going to go well. You guys have a good day. You know, I adore you. Love you. Bye.